Hey everyone, welcome to the 13th series of the Schizophrenic and the Little Girl from the Logic of Sense. James Joyce famously wrote in radically different narrative styles in different sections of his masterpiece Ulysses. Deleuze will take a little page from that experiment in this chapter, as his writing takes on a markedly different tone than the previous chapters. He'll give this chapter a tripartite arrangement, which he delineates as the madman, the poet, and the little girl. The madman refers to two examples that he uses, the first one being Antonin Artaud, a French surrealist writer, artist, playwright, confined for many years in asylums in France, circa the beginning of the 20th century, but also someone who had a huge influence on Deleuze in later books. The second madman that he uses to illustrate this chapter is an American named Felix Wolfson. The little girl refers to Alice or Lewis Carroll, because he's contrasting the writings of the schizophrenic and how these schizophrenics, Artaud and Wolfson, use language as compared to the nonsense that Carroll uses. The poet, I think, refers to Deleuze himself in this, but it means it's a general term. At another place, he refers to the poet as the artist, and it's basically someone who can go down into the depths of the body where the schizophrenics are and come back up into the surface and communicate what they've gotten from the depths. And this is how he distinguishes the writings of Artaud and Wolfson with Lewis Carroll. That Lewis Carroll is, all his nonsense is on the surface. Whereas with Artaud and Wolfson, they're in the depths of their bodies. And for them, the surface has collapsed. The frontier between things and words is no longer there. Words have become like things. The division between words and things is with sense. Sense is on both sides of those two series, but with the language of schizophrenics, that frontier has collapsed. There is no sense in the writings of Artaud and Wolfson. In this collapse of the surface, the entire world loses its meaning. Both of those writers came up with their own language. And that's what Deleuze will spend a lot of time in this chapter analyzing. As for Wolfson, he couldn't bear to read or hear language in his mother tongue, which was English. So he would always translate it into foreign languages that had the same sound and the same meaning. So he basically came up with his own language based on that, and he wrote a book called Schizophrenia and Language. So I want to point out also that the poet, the madman, and the little girl also can signify James Joyce, because James Joyce had a daughter named Lucia who was schizophrenic. She was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And Joyce also refused to believe this. And he took her to see Carl Jung, the famous psychoanalyst, at one point, and he told Jung, what Lucia is doing with language is the same thing that I'm doing with language, referring to his writings that would become Finnegan's Wake. And Jung told him, what you're doing, you're diving into the depths. You're coming back up to the surface. And what Lucia is doing, she's drowning. She's sinking into the depths and she's not coming up. So the poet is Joyce. He's able to go down into the depths, encounter the world of madness, and come back up and come back to the surface. and present it. And James Joyce is even directly referred to in the last footnote of this chapter. With Artaud was very concerned with communicating sensations, communicating things without having to use conventional language. So he kind of came up with his own language, which Deleuze analyzes, and he calls some of them breath words and some of them howl words. And so there's a pretty strong analysis of this. So even though this chapter has a much different writing style, it follows directly in from the previous chapter, where he left off by saying that the surface has an extreme and persistent fragility to it. He begins this chapter by saying nothing is more fragile than the surface. So that is the subject of this chapter, the fragility of the surface, and how nonsense can rise up and overwhelm and take over and obliterate the surface. So this nonsense is opposed to what he called good sense and common sense in the previous chapter. One of the examples from Alice that he used in the previous chapter was Humpty Dumpty, who is the master of language and the giver of sense. Artaud criticizes both Lewis Carroll and Humpty Dumpty, and at one point he attempted a translation of Jabberwocky, but he ended up getting disgusted by Carroll. He's disgusted because, and he put this directly in a letter, that Carroll is up on the surface. Carroll's nonsense has to do with the surface, and there is this division between words and things, whereas for Artaud, it's in the depths of the bodies, and Artaud feels a lot of suffering because of this that Carroll does not have, and so Artaud criticizes him, and he'll actually call Carroll a pervert. And so the schizophrenic and the little girl, it sounds a little bit perverted, and that's from Artaud's point of view, from the in the depths of bodies. Okay, so Deleuze begins this chapter by presenting a problem, the problem of what if nonsense rises up so much that it overwhelms the surface, that it just sinks the person into the bottom. But like any good problem, he also states the solution to it. So the solution to this problem of being overwhelmed by nonsense is attention. The first time Deleuze says that, he says, talking about the rising up of nonsense, he said, it is for this reason that the observer must be attentive. A few sentences later, he's talking about sliding between the madman, the poet, and the little girl, and he says we must be attentive to this sliding, which reveals a profound difference underlying these crude similarities. And the third time he uses the word attentive. He says we must be attentive to the very difficult functions and abysses of nonsense. So attention is the solution. He says this, uses the word attentive 3 times in like 2 paragraphs. And for Hermetic writings, that's like a tip-off when something is repeated 3 times very shortly, that it brings attention to that thing. So he's bringing attention to attention as a solution for the rising up of nonsense. And it's very true that attention can be strengthened, and you can learn how to focus your attention more when you're traveling through realms of chaos and nonsense. So Deleuze holds Artaud in very high regard, and his analysis of things, which he calls an infrasense, a sense below the surface. So Artaud will give Deleuze an important concept in his future writings, which he writes about a little bit in this chapter, called the body without organs, which Deleuze calls a superior body. The body without organs is like a body without organization. We found out from the last chapter that common sense is a function of an organ. And so a body without organs is like a body without common sense. Common sense meaning the sense of identity, the sense that we're relatively the same person today that we were yesterday. It's also the sense that allows us to recognize things. We recognize the common sense of any object. Okay, but the body without organs, in this tripartite arrangement, I would connect with the little girl. The little girl meaning the spiritual babe, the development of the spiritual body, which is a body without common sense. So you don't have your normal identity. There is a body after you've lost all your sense of identity, after you lost your personality and everything you know, you're still there. There is a body. Sometimes it's called the deep self. Sometimes it's called the voyager, because it can be experienced when you lose all your normal sense of self-identity, which according to the Tibetan Buddhists is what happens when your physical body dies, that your consciousness carries on in a body similar to like a body without organs, but without any of your old personality or your old identity. All that goes away. In the case of Lewis Wolfson, he'll analyze it from two series of orality, the series of things and propositions, or to eat and to speak. And he also call that to pay or to speak, which is a Kabbalistic pun, because the Hebrew letter, also pronounced pay, is connected with the mouth. In a footnote, he'll, when he's talking about the types of language that Artaud and Wolfson have come up with, he'll use that the one series of consonants has a yod in it, which is another Hebrew letter. So there's he's making some sort of Kabbalistic associations there. In the schizophrenic language of Artaud and Wolfson, Deleuze will talk about passion words and action words. Passion words, he says, explodes into phonetics that can actually hurt the body, that can feel like it's hurting the body, because remember, the surface has collapsed. There is no separation between words and things to the schizophrenic. Whereas action words are expressed with a tonic value, in other words, with how they sound. The passion words and the action words will refer to two kinds of theater, Deleuze will say. The theater of terror or passion, and the theater of cruelty, which is in its essence active. Now, the theater of cruelty refers to a famous essay Artaud wrote, where he was talking about the theater expressing things without having to go through the medium of ordinary language. And this text, it's a PDF, which I'll post in the description. And I think it's something every artist or every performer would find value in reading. Both passion and action words are devoid of sense. And this is what makes the big difference between Artaud and Wolfson and Carroll. There's no sense in the depths of body. But even on the surface, we can find schizophrenic fragments, because the surface also has things brought up from the depths. But all this is leading up to psychoanalysis. This is the first time in Logic of Sense Deleuze is speaking of psychoanalysis. The whole chapter has a tone of psychoanalysis. And the last third or so of Logic of Sense is all about psychoanalysis. So this chapter shifts a little bit in that direction and introduces psychoanalysis. It introduces psychoanalysis with a criticism of it, saying that psychoanalysis shouldn't start with a history, it should start with a geography, meaning it should start with what territory is the person being analyzed in. Are they on the surface? Are they in the depths of their bodies? Maybe they're in the heights out there, so where are they at? Whereas starting with the history is how conventional Freudian analysis would do it with, what happened in your early childhood, what happened to you as an infant, how did your parents treat you, etc. So his criticism of psychoanalysis, I'll just read it. He'll say, psychoanalysis cannot content itself with the designation of cases, the manifestation of histories, or the signification of complexes. Psychoanalysis is the psychoanalysis of sense. So that is where Deleuze is going to take this. From the esoteric point of view, this is series 13. 13 is a key number for the path of Gemel, the third letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which connects the Sephirah of Tifereth to the Sephirah of Kether, and goes across a territory known as the abyss. And in the abyss, you lose your common sense, you lose your good sense. It's very much a schizophrenic-like and chaotic realm. And I think reading this chapter would provide help or information, or at least a familiar kind of feeling to someone who might be experiencing the territory of the abyss. And Deleuze will continue talking about the fragility of sense in the next chapter, which is the 14th series of double causality, and we'll see you then.